now this is now nearly 6,000 years old. So I always ask black students of every level, why are you afraid of mathematics when your ancestors invented it? Why would you want to give it up and give it away when it is a product of Africa? Next slide, please. For those of you who have been to Kemet, you have undoubtedly seen the Temple of Dendera. Behind the Temple of Dendera, which is dedicated to Hathor, or Het-Her, is a chapel dedicated to Isis. There is a place as you move into the central vestibule of the chapel dedicated to Isis, where you have to imagine that this is actually up above you. There is this square aperture down through which light beams or shines. You see, now you look at these, what these represent are really light waves or white light beams. But you see, they have waveforms. So here, they are demonstrating that the people of ancient Kemet understood that light moves in waves. That wasn't known in Europe until Newton and Christian Huygens in the 17th century. That's about 2,000 years later. Next slide. In fact, they are very ingenious in their use of light. Those of you who have been and seen the temples and the tombs will note that you can go into the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible recesses of the temples, and you will find these brilliantly colored, very precise scenes. And yet there's no soot or any evidence of combustion. So that means they didn't use candles. Now, unless you're going to say that they used electricity, and I don't even want to get into that just yet, let's take a simple answer and then speculate later about electricity. Is that what they apparently did, though, which was equally as effective as electricity, was they used a system of mirrors to bring light in from the surface all the way into the deepest, darkest recesses of the temple in such a way that they could literally light up the entire temple that way. Next slide, please. Now, this is what you all came to hear, believe it or not, so let's spend some time with it. We've already talked about that the Earth is not just a static ball in space. It's not only smooth, but it spins. It spins on its axis. But because of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon, it doesn't spin in a straight up and down spinning motion. It tilts because of the gravitational attraction. Now, those of you who have children and or grandchildren, and if you've ever bought a top for them, go home tonight and spin the top. If you don't spin the top completely straight up and down, you will find that while the top is spinning, it wobbles and describes a circle. Well, that is exactly what the Earth does, and that circle that top makes as it wobbles is called the precession. So that the Earth, the celestial North Pole, wobbles around the North Pole of the ecliptic, which is the vertical North Pole, in a period of 26,000 years. This is a period that was discovered in Africa minimally 50,000 years ago. Now, what did they do? Well, they did a couple of things. Over the years, after they had discovered this phenomenon, they divided this circle into two different cycles or circles, one around the equator and one around the North Pole of the ecliptic. The one around the equator was divided into 12 arcs, and in each arc there was a constellation given to define the arc. And with 26,000 years, what you would do is that you would stand at the first day of spring, the spring equinox, and watch what constellation rose at dawn. And that would be the constellation that defined the age. But that if you watched for 2,160 years, slowly but surely that constellation would move out of that position and another constellation would move in its place. And if you stood there for 26,000 years, the original constellation would come back that you first started to observe. Well, you can do the same thing for the North Pole. But you see, in the North Pole, there are only 7 constellations, so it's 3,700 years. But both of them are what they call great years. Now, what we're in the constellation right now is that rises at the spring equinox is Pisces. But Pisces is moving, in 100 years, will move off of the horizon, and Aquarius will move in its place. Now, Aquarius now is called the water man, but Aquarius wasn't the water man to begin with. Aquarius was the great mistress of the waters, Hathor Nut. And later, we turned into the water man as Hapi. And you note that to show you that Hapi was originally female, Hapi, the god of the Nile, and that her Nile has a female breast. Well, what we're interested in actually, we're interested in that, yes. And we're also interested in what happens around the North Pole. Because you see, right now what's in place, the North Pole star is in the constellation of the Great Bear. Little Bears. But the Little Bear is a Greek word, a Greek term. According to, if you go back into this planisphere of Dendera and Kemet, it wasn't a little bear at all, it was a jackal. And this is the reason why jackals, wolves, foxes, and dogs have such importance, right? Have had such importance over the last 3,000 years, symbolically. And we could go into that, but for lack of time, let's move on. But what is getting ready to happen, however, is that these two cycles are getting ready to coincide for the only twice in 26,000 years that they do that, at the beginning of the cycle and in the middle of the cycle. Where we're in the middle of a 26,000 year cycle, and in the next 100 years, the two cycles will coincide. We've already talked about Hathor Nut, the great mother of the waters. But, next slide, please. Okay, and this shows you what happens, okay? This just shows you what happens. This is the North Star, and slowly but surely, this is the North Star. The North Stars change every 3,700 years, and slowly but surely, the constellations change every 2,160 years. So this shows you the two phenomena of the great year, the two precessions, both defined by the same phenomenon. Next slide, please. And this is the zodiac of Dendera, which shows you the entire Egyptian heaven, northern heaven in particular, and the whole phenomenon of the precession. We don't have time to go into detail on that because we could do an entire lecture just on this. Next slide, please. But here, next slide, please. Next slide, please. But here is where it comes home in a very immediate way that we can all understand. This is the northern heaven. You see, here is the great little bear, and that's Polaris. That's the North Star now. But 100 years, it won't be the North Star, and therefore the little bear, or really the jackal, won't be the defining constellation of the polar age. Who is moving? Because it is this constellation that is moving into place in the North Pole position. Now, even though the drawing doesn't show you this, it is Cepheus, but when Cepheus moves into the North Pole position in about 100 years or less, and by the way, those effects are already being felt, because when you move from one age to the next, the effects are felt for at least 150 years to 200 years even before you get to that point. Now, but who is Cepheus? Cepheus is the Ethiopian king. You wonder why the Million Man March happened the way it happened? It was cosmically preordained. Cepheus, even though he doesn't look like an Ethiopian, that's what he is. He's the Ethiopian king in mythology. He is going to be the ruler of the next age. So it's the black Ethiopian king who will rule the next age. And now you can see why the Million Man March happened the way it did, why it drew that many men in one place, right around the lake that's designed after the lake at Karnak, next to the Ben stone. So you have to understand, Jesus himself said, there will be portents in the sun and moon and stars, and the celestial powers will be shaken. The celestial powers will be shaken, yes, because this celestial power will move and another celestial power will be in place, and that will be the celestial power of the Black King. It's not because I want it to be that way, it is because what God and nature and the cosmos intended. So we are being pulled along by cosmic forces that we are only dimly aware of. And our history, therefore, is cosmically determined. Even the reassertion of the principle that has been evident for the last 15 years is cosmically determined because it is Hathor Nut who is going to define the next zodiac, the next zodiacal age in the same time, 100 years. So it's going to be the great mother of the waters walking hand in hand with the Ethiopian king that will determine world history for the next 2,000 years. Next slide, please. This is just one of the methods. We have no evidence that they had telescopes, but they had very effective methods, even without a lot of sophisticated apparatus, for making the most refined and precise measurements of heavenly bodies. And this is one of them, to give you the declination and azimuth of stars that are rising and setting over the horizon. Next slide, please. Now, look at this. Those of you who've been to Kemet will recognize it immediately as the Temple of Karnak. Karnak is so large, it was a city within a city. It was the holy city. It was a city of God. It was the original Vatican. It could hold and support 50,000 people. Because if you've ever been there, the place is just mammoth. It's huge. And if you take the regular tour, it doesn't give you all of it. But I want you see this. This is the central corridor, the central alignment of Karnak. You, as you are watching it, are standing at the west. Now, that central axis is actually oriented in such a way, it is oriented to the western hills, so precisely that on the first day of summer, June 21st, as the sun sets over the western hills, and just before it goes down the hills, it throws a thin shaft of light right down that corridor, and it doesn't do that anymore, but it did when it was built. And it flashed for 5 minutes on the Holy of Holies in the sanctuary. You got to understand, you see, these pylons and gates were narrow. They narrow and narrow and narrow, and there was the roof over Karnak. And so what they did is that they concentrated the beam of light in the exact same way cameras and telescopes do. So it wasn't just a temple, it was also an almanac and a calendar. Next slide, please. Now, the Great Pyramid. Yeah, yes. As you know, the Washington Monument is just a copy of the Ben stone, which is the sacred monument of the so-called obelisk, which was sacred to the sun. And we could spend a whole lecture doing nothing but that. Now, when Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, he brought an army of technicians and surveyors with him, and scientists. The first thing he asked them to do was to measure his new domain. Well, they found out that their job was very easy, because all they had to do was project an imaginary line through the middle of the pyramid due north, and where it crossed the Mediterranean coast, it bisected the delta into two equilateral triangles, which could therefore be measured by trigonometry. So if Napoleon could do that, then the priest physician, or the priest scientist who put that in place could do that. Let's continue. Next slide, please. The pyramid rises to a height of 481.5 feet. It is built of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest stone is 2.5 tons, and the largest stone is somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. If you were to take the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid, by the way, can you hear me in the back? I don't want you to miss any of this. If you could take all of the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid and cut it up into 1-foot blocks, you could build a wall that would circle 2/3 of the globe. And you know they built it without even using the wheel? They used to float 1,000-ton blocks of granite from Aswan 500 miles down the river, and they can't even do that today. The pyramid was oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The base of the pyramid, the side of each base of the pyramid was 755 feet, 6 inches, with an average error of 1/10,000th. The casing stones that covered the pyramid were so finely jointed that you could not and cannot insert a piece of your hair in between the joints, even today, where they are still in existence. The area of the base of the pyramid is 13 acres. But it's real interesting. If you look at the height of the pyramid, it is, if you measure it, it is the radius of a circle that you can create by turning the base of the square base of the pyramid into a circle. And therefore you can find the square base by the area of the perimeter of the square base by 2 pi r. So that means they had built the constant, the geometric constant of pi, into the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, and it used to shine down to the grotto into a pool of water. And of course, it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been anything like it in the world. Nothing. Do you know the other thing about the Great Pyramid? Where the Great Pyramid sits, if you were to take all the longitude, there are 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, right? The longitude of the Great Pyramid goes through more landmass than any other longitude in the world. The latitude of the Great Pyramid, going right through the Great Pyramid, goes through more latitudinal landmass than any other latitude in the world. So the Great Pyramid, from the point of view of land, is the center of the Earth. This is the reason why that not only in Egypt, but in Greece, Rome, Palestine, India, and China, build their cities in fixed intervals to the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid was the prime meridian. The prime meridian we got now going through Greenwich, England, is a complete artifact. It's not based on anything. The original prime meridian was the Great Pyramid. Next slide, please. In early spring, when the sun rises just high enough above the apex of the Great Pyramid, the whole shadow of the north face vanishes at the stroke of noon, and therefore they can tell the beginning of the first day of spring. Next slide, please. Let's read the legend. The truncated pyramid depicted by Proctor would have made an absolute platform 142 feet high and 175 feet square. The cardinal points or compass roads could have been marked by the upright posts on the periphery of the platform. To locate the rising and setting of stars east and west, azimuth observers could occupy the center of the square from which they could command the entire compass. What happened was, before they finished the pyramid, they stopped construction. This is at the 50th course. The 50th course is exactly half the area of the base. And from there, they made all of these observations and measurements. Then they finished. They did that maybe for a year, and then they finished the pyramid. Next slide, please. It just so happened what we call the Grand Gallery, which points directly south on the 50th concourse. According to Proctor, a 19th century astronomer, when you look at this, what they call, there's a word for it, I'm forgetting it. You see this kind of shape here, where it's kind of beveled like that. He says, no architect by himself would ever make an opening with this kind of a shape. He says the only ones to whom that would be necessary would be astronomers. Because what they would do is that they would post trained sky watchers up and down this gallery, so at night they could take measurement after measurement of these stars moving across this meridian. That means they could determine a meridian in the sky, which is a longitude, and they could determine a meridian on the earth. They could also determine the speed of the star moving across this meridian, and therefore that would allow them to determine the speed of the rotation of the vault of heaven, which is another way of saying they could determine the speed of the rotation of Earth. Next slide, please. I'm going to, in the interest of time, let's go on because this is there's some other, I want to get to something else. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Piri-Reis map. The Piri-Reis map was compiled in 1513 by a Turkish admiral by the name of Piri-Reis. He had 20 maps at his disposal. One came from Columbus, and I'll tell you in a minute where the others came from. Now you look at this map, I hope you can see it. You see the western bulge of Africa, you see Spain, the Mediterranean, the eastern prominence of South America, the Caribbean, and Antarctica. You see these compass roses and these lines moving in diagonal directions from the compass roses, but you see all of these particular features of the map are in correct latitudinal and longitudinal relationship to one another. Map making of this exactitude wasn't even possible in Europe until 250 years later, because it wasn't until then that they could even determine longitude. This map was compiled from earlier maps that were even more accurate and even more sophisticated, and these maps, according to Piri-Reis himself, came from the time of Alexander, 300 years BC. But what does that mean? When we say time of Alexander, that's just a time. Where was the center of the map? And remember, this is called a Portolano map. The center of the map would be the place where, in a sense, the map was built. The original maps were situated. You look at these compass roses. These represent the left ring of a perfect circle. You can see that the map is torn off. If the map was complete, you would see the rest of Africa, Asia, India, etc. But it is possible through trigonometry to determine the center of the map, and therefore the place where the map makers themselves were situated, 300 BC and earlier. Next slide, please. Again, this just shows you diagrammatically the compass roses as a left rim of a circle through the Atlantic. Next slide, please. The center of the map was determined after 2 years of numerous calculations to be 23.5 degrees north and 30 degrees east. Now, where is that? Next slide, please. It's 100 miles west of Aswan in Upper Egypt. Now you got to understand something. To have made a map like this, not only would they have had to have precise knowledge of Africa, South America, Europe, they would have to have precise knowledge of the entire world. You got to understand something. The idea that nobody started sailing oceans until Columbus decided to do so, at least not the Atlantic Ocean, is a fiction. Again, it has nothing to do with historical reality, or across the Pacific, for that matter. How did the Hawaiians get to Hawaii? A people from the Tongan Islands sailed in catamaran canoes, not once but in waves, over 3,000 miles of open ocean, using only the stars and their knowledge of the movement of waves and how clouds form and wind patterns to guide them. There was an African kingdom called a city called Malindi on the East African coast that sent in 1415, 80 years before Columbus, a giraffe across the Indian Ocean and up the South China Sea to the Emperor of China. The Greeks, there are 6 surviving Greek references to a land across the Atlantic with valleys, rivers, and mountains. So you got to understand, there was already a worldwide network of trade, diplomacy, commerce, overland and across all seas when the Spanish and Portuguese came and took it away. It involved everybody: African, Arab, Asian, and Amerindian. And it went back at least 2,000 years, 2,500 years before Columbus. You can see what has been done to history. History has been turned upside down on its head. Because, you see, if you deconstruct history, then when it's put back together, you can put it back in your own image. And every so often, less now than formerly, I will go in front of an audience, and a black person will stand up. Well, Dr. Finch, why is this important? It's all very well and nice, and it's all very well and good, and it makes us feel good, but why study history? What does that have to do with our problems today? And I said, nobody but a black American would ever ask that question. The Chinese would never ask it. Europeans would never ask it. Mexicans, the only time I ever hear it asked is by a black American, because they know the function of history. Your problem today is a function or a product of history and your perception of it. That's what Sheikh Anta Diop said. He talked about the collective amnesia of people of African descent, causing a depersonalization, an alienation, a loss of sense of self and belonging, which to me is an acceptable definition of mental illness. Next slide, please. This was found in Saqqara, dated to 300 BC, and at first was said to be a bird, until a NASA engineer said, next slide please, birds do not have reverse dihedral wings and vertical tails. So this is a glider and an aerodynamically sound glider. Not an airplane, but it just shows you that in African science they had already started experimenting with aerodynamics 300 years before Jesus was born. So again, why are we afraid to be engineers? Next slide, please. It wasn't just in Kemet. You say, oh, Dr. Finch, this is just a bunch of stones looking like they're getting ready to fall over. Well, funny thing about those stones in what is now southwestern Kenya, northwestern Kenya, in Namaratunga, they look like they're getting ready to fall over. Next slide. Are oriented precisely to 7 major stars or star groupings. And the people then and now use the risings, particularly of this star, Triangulum, and all the rest of them, correlated with phases of the moon to create their own calendar. There is no other calendar like it anywhere in the world. In fact, all of your major calendars are African. Lunar calendar, stellar calendar, solar calendar, calendar based on the movements of Sirius. And this calendar is just, nobody knows, has found anything else like it anywhere else. Next slide, please. You say, okay, what are these men standing up next to? Well, what they're standing up next to is actually an iron smelter and steel maker, 10 feet high, made of termite mud and or anthill mud. Why? Because termite mud and anthill mud is impermeable to water. You see those blowholes here. Usually they're 8 to 10, excuse me. Next slide. And what they do is they blow in preheated air in such a way that at the combustion zone, they're able to achieve temperatures of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody was able to do that until 150 years ago.